The Soviet Union is a funny thing. Some people idealize it and miss the old days, while others talk about the millions of innocents sent to camps and rejoice in the collapse of such a great power. But where is the truth? And most importantly, what would have happened if the USSR had not collapsed? Dozens of dissertations and research papers have been written on this topic, but in fact, a short and accessible essence can be put into a few minutes of video. That's what we're going to do now, namely demonstrate how, of course, after your comment about whether you would like to live in the USSR or not. Because, as it always happens, the process of state collapse was accompanied by billions of little things. And if any of them had been turned in the other direction, the result could have been different. Let's start with the main thing, with people. According to the all-union referendum on March 17, 1991, 77% of the inhabitants of the USSR voted in favor of preserving the Union, and the referendum was very powerful, almost 100. 50 million people took part in it. It created a funny paradox, because the result of the popular vote is more important than the instructions of any of the presidents, leaders, or bosses, and the rulers of Russia, Ukraine, and other countries had to do their best to legally recognize the results of the referendum as illegal or outdated. This vote is still relied upon by many fans of the USSR, but several important amendments need to be taken into account. First, the vote was not about preserving the Union in its former form. If it was literally about preserving the USSR as a renewed federation of equal and sovereign republics, the wording is as vague and ambiguous as possible. It turns out that by voting in favor, people simultaneously voted both for the preservation of the USSR and independence of their country in particular, because that is what the referendum was about. The referendum implied the formation of a new union of sovereign states, which was to be the name of the renewed entity. As it is easy to notice, the prefix Soviet from the names disappeared. Such a concept was also there, but some parts of the country proclaimed their independence on live TV. And the leadership of the state, headed by Gorbachev, tried to think of anything to reform the federation, to keep it in the same borders, even at the cost of eliminating the Communist Party at the head. The idea failed, and the referendum itself is suspicious, because, in addition to the murky wording, there were also Latvia and Estonia and other countries that actually refused to hold it. The story of how and from where the votes were received is rather murky and does not play a role now. The referendum and everything that happened since 1990 was a stage of agony, and to understand what the world would have been like if the USSR had survived, we need to look at it in detail. The reasons for the collapse are unfortunately very numerous. The favorite argument of opponents of the Soviet Union is toilet paper, and indeed, according to most sources, it is so. In mass mode, it began to use only at the beginning of the 70th year. On November 3, 1969, there was a launch of a Department of Rural paper mill, which produced ordinary toilet paper on an industrial scale. Of course, it was before that, but not in those quantities and not in that hygienic form as in the Western countries. Someone claims that individual plants for the production stood even before the Second World War. But this is the very detail of the collapsed Union. Reliable, independent, and objective sources that can be believed in. It was a little, the truth should be. Even catastrophes of Chernobyl level were concealed to the last. But there was also Admiral Nakhimov, who drowned, gas explosions, and numerous aviation incidents. What is worth only the biggest catastrophe in the history of Armenia, when in 1988, on the length of Nakhon 70, 7 people died in the crash of IL-76M. All these events were concealed, which could not but create an oppressive atmosphere in society and distrust of Soviet technology in general. After all, Until now, the supporters of the USSR use all foreign achievements of science and technology to convey their thoughts to us. Already in the early 80s, the term Soviet meant something of poor quality. The reason for this was the government's course of mass production. Manufacturers were not interested in the quality of goods, and the party demanded quantity. Since 1953 in the USSR, the plan of evaluation of enterprises did not focus on quality. Only volumes were put on paper, and that is why in the Union the position of a car mechanic meant something magical. Everything depended on him because cars broke down at every step. It is not worth going into details here. It is enough just to say that, up to these very days in people's heads, there is a simple philosophy: imported is better than domestic. This was inherited from the atmosphere of the end of the USSR, and we do not need any arguments or facts. The main mistake made by everyone who enters into the dispute about the preservation of the Union communism. The USSR, for some reason, is considered a communist state, but in reality, it is not even close to it. The Union was a semi-feudal empire with a clear ruling class, and it was not the working people and nomenclatura, officials, army, bureaucrats, that's who ruled the country and was in different conditions. Look at the signboard of the Soviet store Birch. Do you know that ordinary workers were not allowed to go there, but inside you could freely buy Mars bars, Ferrero candies, and any products of the damn capitalists, as they called it? It was actually eaten by people who made myths about the most useful Soviet products ironic, isn't it? Of course, many people will start throwing facts and arguments against this point, but there is one point that describes the situation best. After WWII, Germany was divided into several parts, but Germans wanted to be united. But the Germans wanted to be a united state, and at the first opportunity, they tore down the wall that divided them. And at the same time, almost all of Eastern Europe was under the influence of the USSR. But when Gorbachev issued a decree to stop interfering in the affairs of other countries, magic happened. In 1989, the communists were ousted in Czechoslovakia. In 1990 in Poland, and almost all the countries of the camp instantly shifted to democratic rails. People did not like the current system, which was supported by the army and total censorship, When the USSR collapsed, there were no powerful movements for unification similar to the German one. The overwhelming majority of countries were happy about their independence and are still happy today. And therefore, when talking about what the world would be like if the USSR had survived the Soviet Union, if the USSR had survived, we have to start from a few time points. First and banal, in 1991, after the referendum, the unity of the Union is held by force. Democrats and supporters of independence are liquidated by the KGB, and the good old Soviet Union returns. What would have changed with this outcome? Nothing. Just add to the current situation the total impossibility to go abroad, getting foreign products, and learning at least some truthful information from the media. The power of the classical USSR is based on force, and we would already be in jail to keep the same union in 1991. Everything becomes a little more cheerful if we go back 5 years to the beginning of the reign of Mr. Gorbachev in general. He conceived the only possible in that situation reform, perestroika. Everything looked great on paper. Freedom of speech, transition to a market economy, fair elections, but it was realized as badly as possible. Instead of glasnost, people got hidden Chernobyl. Instead of a market economy, food on cards. And instead of fair elections, numerous riots and the emergence of murky politicians from nowhere. And for God's sake, do not call us fans of the series from HBO. There is an official paper according to which everything is fine at the nuclear plant and evacuation of Pripyat is not necessary. Until the good Scandinavians didn't detect a radioactive cloud, no one was in a hurry to save people. The nomenclatura didn't want to lose its privileged status and did everything to preserve it. But if the Union really deformed as it looked on paper, the situation would be more than funny, because the closest analog of the final state, according to Gorbachev's plans, is the USA. And there, each state has its own laws. But at the same time, only marginal units shout about independence. In Arizona, you can't feed garbage to pigs. And in Illinois, legalized marijuana, approximately such a structure was planned in the Union of Sovereign States. Everyone does what he wants formally, obeying a single center. The trouble is that the upper class of the USSR did not want to lose the trough, and the lower classes were too tired of the low standard of living and were ready to support anyone to change anything. But if Gorbachev and his team had unsucceeded in adequate perestroika, the world would have been a funny place. Many blame the USA for hybrid warfare and imposing their values. But what prevented the USSR from doing the same? Only the lack of real competitors, Western cars, movies, jeans, and many other things. And most importantly, the same powerful advertising of these products. If there was an opportunity to do business without kickbacks and theft, then the still mighty industrial base of the USSR would definitely produce something good. You don't need to go far for an example. It is in China. They also copied Western developments for a long time, but eventually began to produce worthy analogs to Western products, which many people use even in the USSR. Just perestroika in China was conducted differently, raping not the people, but the officials. Thus, there are two versions of the hypothetical surviving USSR, the first and classical one. People still dream about foreign kitchen sets, watching the children of officials eating Kinder Surprises from stores for the privileged. And the second one, the Union of Independent States, was on a difficult but realizable path of its own, with its iPhones and Mercedes. But it turned out the way it turned out, and it is not worth blaming only the authorities for it. After all, the mentality and history are too different from the Western ones, and the emergence of a fair and powerful state is not a good idea.